Most people don't fail because they lack discipline. They fail because emotion keeps hijacking the system. You can have the best routine in the world, the clearest goals, the most structured schedule, and still fall apart the moment you're stressed, anxious, bored, or overwhelmed. That's not a willpower problem. That's an emotional regulation problem. And here's the reframe that changes everything. If your emotional state is allowed to change your standards, then your discipline was never actually stable, it was just conditional. This video breaks down the real skill behind consistency, which is learning to manage your internal state before it manages you. Discipline is downstream of state management. That's the idea worth sitting with before anything else. When people talk about building discipline, they usually focus on behavior, waking up earlier, following through on commitments, resisting temptation. But behavior is the output. What drives the output is your emotional and physiological state at the moment of decision. If you're dysregulated, flooded with cortisol, emotionally reactive, or mentally exhausted, your capacity for self-directed behavior collapses. Not because you're weak, but because the part of your brain responsible for planning, impulse control, and goal-directed action, the prefrontal cortex, becomes functionally impaired under stress. This is well documented in neuroscience. Stress doesn't just feel bad, it literally reduces your ability to make good decisions. So the real question isn't, how do I become more disciplined? It's, how do I maintain the internal conditions under which disciplined behavior is even possible? That's what emotional regulation is. It's the practice of recognizing, understanding, and managing your emotional states so they don't override your intentions. And the reason this gets overlooked is because most productivity and self-help content focuses exclusively on systems and habits, treating the person executing those systems as if they're a stable machine. But you're not a machine, and your internal state fluctuates. The skill is learning to work with that fluctuation instead of pretending it doesn't exist. Let's talk about what emotional dysregulation actually looks like in practice, because it rarely announces itself clearly. It usually shows up as avoidance. You keep delaying a task you committed to starting, not because you don't care, but because approaching it triggers some low-level discomfort you haven't examined. It shows up as inconsistency. You're all in on your goals for a week, and then an argument, a bad night of sleep, or a frustrating day at work erases the momentum entirely. It shows up as rationalization. You find seemingly logical reasons to abandon the plan in the moment, telling yourself you'll start again Monday, or that the timing isn't right, when actually you're just uncomfortable and looking for an exit. The behavior looks like a discipline failure, but the root is emotional. One of the most useful frameworks for understanding this comes from the work on affect and decision-making. Your emotional state at any given moment creates what researchers call an affective filter on your perception. When you're in a negative or high-stress state, your brain's threat detection system becomes hyperactive, and you tend to perceive tasks, challenges, and commitments through a lens of burden and risk. When you're in a regulated, grounded state, those same tasks appear more manageable. The task doesn't change, your emotional lens does. And your behavior follows the lens, not the reality. This is why the same person can feel completely capable of tackling a hard project on Tuesday and completely incapable of touching it on Wednesday. It's not ability that shifted, it's state. This brings up a question worth exploring. What are the actual mechanisms of emotional regulation, and how do you build them? There are a few that have genuine support behind them. The first is called cognitive reappraisal. This is the practice of changing the meaning you assign to a situation before your emotional response fully crystallizes. Instead of treating a difficult task as a threat, you frame it as information or as a challenge you've navigated before. This isn't positive thinking in the superficial sense. It's deliberately intervening in the appraisal process that triggers the emotion. Research by psychologist James Gross, who has spent decades studying emotion regulation, consistently shows that reappraisal is one of the most effective regulation strategies. because it interrupts the emotional response at the source rather than trying to suppress it after the fact. The second mechanism is physiological. Your emotional state is not purely psychological, it has a direct biological component. Heart rate, breathing patterns, muscle tension, and nervous system activation are all part of how an emotion is processed in the body. One of the most accessible ways to shift your state is through controlled breathing, specifically extending the exhale longer than the inhale, which activates the parasympathetic nervous system and reduces the physiological signature of stress. This sounds simple, and it is, but the reason it's effective is mechanistic, not motivational. You're not talking yourself out of a bad mood. You're changing the conditions in your nervous system that are sustaining it. The third mechanism is what you might call environmental staging, which means designing your context to reduce the emotional friction that triggers dysregulation in the first place. This includes things like sleep, which is one of the most significant variables in emotional reactivity. Sleep deprivation measurably increases amygdala reactivity to negative stimuli, meaning a tired version of you is genuinely more emotionally volatile than a rested version of you. This isn't a character flaw, it's physiology. The same logic applies to hunger, social isolation, and chronic overstimulation. Your environment and your habits either support or undermine your baseline regulation capacity. Most people try to fix their discipline while ignoring the conditions that make regulation impossible. Now here's where this gets directly practical. If you want consistency, you need to stop relying on motivation and willpower as your primary mechanisms, because both are state-dependent. Motivation is high when your emotional state is positive and low when it's not. Willpower, or more precisely, executive function, is depleted by stress, decision fatigue, and sleep deprivation. Neither of those things is a reliable foundation for long-term behavior. What is reliable is a system that accounts for your state rather than assuming it'll always be favorable. This looks like having a minimum viable version of every commitment, something you do even on the hard days that keeps the pattern intact. It looks like building in transition rituals before tasks you consistently avoid, something small and grounding that shifts your state before the work begins. And it looks like tracking your emotional patterns over time so you can recognize when you're in a low regulation period and adjust your expectations without abandoning your direction entirely. There's also a concept worth addressing around identity and emotional regulation that doesn't get discussed enough. A lot of people tie their self-worth to their level of output. When they're productive and consistent, they feel good about themselves. When they fall off, they feel like failures. This creates a feedback loop where the emotional weight of perceived failure makes it harder to regulate, which makes consistency harder, which reinforces the failure narrative. Breaking that loop requires separating your identity from your performance. You are not your output on any given day. Your direction matters more than your rate on any single day. The moment you internalize that, you stop punishing yourself for being human, and paradoxically, you become more consistent because the emotional stakes of a bad day drop significantly. The broader point being made throughout this video is that emotional regulation is not a soft skill sitting somewhere adjacent to discipline. It is the foundational skill that makes discipline functional. Without it, discipline is fragile, vulnerable to every fluctuation in mood, circumstance, and stress. With it, discipline becomes something much closer to what people actually want when they pursue consistency, which is reliable behavior that persists across the inevitable variation of real life. You're not trying to become a person who never feels difficult emotions. You're developing the capacity to feel them without letting them override your commitments. That distinction is the whole thing. If you find yourself frequently falling off your routines, frequently feeling like you just can't on certain days, and frequently confused about why your intentions and your behavior don't match, the answer is rarely more structure. It's usually more regulation. Start there, and the discipline question becomes significantly easier to answer. That is what this channel is built around. Not more motivation, not another willpower hack. The actual internal architecture that makes consistent behavior possible, If you want the next layer, watch Stoic Discipline, why most people never install this mental system. That is where the regulation you just built gets put to work. Subscribe. It's not self-help. It's a system upgrade.